At 13:47 hours on August 7, 1942, Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai sat in the cramped cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter at 20,000 feet above Guadalcanal, watching 8 strange aircraft in formation 2,000 feet below. They looked wrong. Too tight. Too disciplined. American bomber crews didn't fly like that. Sakai had 58 confirmed victories. He was 26 years old. The son of a Sake brewery worker from Saga Prefecture. He had survived 2 years of the Pacific War by trusting his instincts. Every hair on the back of his neck was screaming at him to climb away. He rolled his Zero into a dive anyway. The aircraft below weren't bombers. They were TBF Avengers, torpedo planes bristling with defensive guns, and Saburo Sakai had just made the worst mistake of his life. The rear gunner in the lead Avenger saw him coming. At 200 yards, the 50 caliber Browning machine gun opened fire. The first burst missed. The second burst hit Sakai's windscreen. The third burst went through it. A 50 caliber round weighs half an ounce. It leaves the barrel at 2,910 feet per second. When it hits a human skull at close range, it doesn't just penetrate, it transfers 13,000 foot-pounds of kinetic energy into bone and brain tissue in a fraction of a millisecond. The round entered Sakai's cockpit at an angle. It struck the right side of his flight goggles, shattered the lens, tore through his right eyeball, fragmented against his skull, and blew out a section of bone the size of a child's fist above his right temple. Fragments of lead, glass, bone, and brain matter sprayed across the cockpit. Sakai's world went white, then black, then red. He couldn't see. He couldn't hear. His right arm went limp. His legs stopped responding. Blood was running down his face, into his mouth, soaking his flight suit. The Zero rolled inverted and began to spin. He was 20,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. His squadron was 560 miles away at Rabaul. He was alone, blind, paralyzed, with half his skull destroyed. And he had 4 hours and 47 minutes to live if he wanted to see home again. At 15,000 feet, something in Sakai's brain clicked back online. Not thought, not reason, just the raw animal part of the brain that refuses to die. His left hand found the control stick. He pulled. The Zero's nose came up. The spin stopped. He was flying straight and level, but he still couldn't see anything except blood and darkness. He tried to open his right eye. It wouldn't open. He reached up with his left hand to wipe the blood away. His fingers touched something wet and soft hanging against his cheek. It was his right eyeball, dangling from the socket by the optic nerve. He pushed it back into the socket with his thumb. It fell out again. He pushed it back in again and held it there with his palm while he tried to think. The pain was extraordinary, not sharp, not localized. His entire head felt like it was being crushed in a vice while someone poured gasoline into the wound and lit it on fire. Every heartbeat sent a wave of agony through his skull. His vision in his left eye was blurry, doubled, darkening around the edges. He knew what that meant. He was going into shock. Shock is the body's emergency shutdown protocol. Blood pressure drops. Peripheral vision narrows. Fine motor control fails. Unconsciousness follows in minutes. If Sakai passed out, he would never wake up. The Zero would fly straight until it ran out of fuel, then nose over and hit the ocean at 300 miles per hour. He bit down on his tongue until he tasted blood. The new pain gave him something to focus on. He forced his left eye to scan the cockpit instruments. Airspeed, 180 knots. Altitude, 12,000 feet. Fuel, 3/4 full. Heading, southwest. Wrong direction. Rabaul was northwest. He needed to turn 45 degrees, but turning required coordinated use of stick and rudder. His right arm was useless. His legs were barely responding. He would have to fly the entire turn with his left hand on the stick and his right hand holding his eyeball in its socket. He pushed the stick left. The Zero rolled, the blood in his skull shifted. The world spun. He vomited inside his oxygen mask. The vomit mixed with blood and ran down into his flight suit. He kept the turn going until the compass read northwest, then leveled off. He had 530 miles to go. At 14:12 hours, 25 minutes after being hit, Sakai looked down at his right hand. It was still pressed against his face, holding his eye in. The hand was covered in blood. The eye kept sliding out. He needed a better solution. He pulled a cotton bandage from his emergency kit with his teeth and wrapped it around his head one-handed, using his knees to hold the stick steady. The bandage held the eye in place. It also cut off 80% of his remaining vision. He was now flying a high-performance fighter aircraft 500 miles over open ocean with one working arm, minimal leg control, and approximately 20% vision in one eye. His fuel would last 3 hours and 40 minutes if he didn't change altitude or speed. Any deviation would use more fuel. If he ran out of fuel before reaching Rabaul, he would have to ditch in the ocean. A water landing in a zero was usually fatal. The aircraft's lightweight construction meant it broke apart on impact. Even if he survived the landing, he would drown before anyone found him. He did the math. 3 hours and 40 minutes of fuel, 530 miles to cover. He would have to maintain exactly 145 miles per hour to make it. Not 150, not 140, exactly 145 for 3.5 hours. While blind, while holding his skull together with a bandage. The human eye has 120 million photoreceptors. Saburo Sakai had approximately 24 million working. The optic nerve of his right eye was torn but not severed. Random signals were still firing into his brain. Phantom lights, shapes that weren't there. Doubled images, blind spots that appeared and disappeared. His brain couldn't process the conflicting information. Every few minutes, his vision would simply shut down completely for 10 to 15 seconds. Total blackness. He would wait, counting his heartbeat until his left eye started working again. At 14:45 hours, he saw something that made his blood run cold. 3 dark shapes at 2 o'clock, 5,000 feet below. Aircraft. He couldn't tell if they were Japanese or American. If they were American Wildcats, he was dead. He had no ammunition left. He'd fired everything at the Avengers. He couldn't dogfight. He couldn't even see clearly enough to identify them. He held his course, didn't change altitude, didn't change speed. He watched them through his blurred, doubled vision as they passed 3,000 feet below. They didn't turn toward him. After 2 minutes, they disappeared into cloud cover. He never knew what they were. At 15:30 hours, Sakai's left arm started to cramp. He had been holding the stick in the same position for an hour and 43 minutes. The muscle fibers in his forearm were locked in sustained contraction. The cramping spread from his forearm to his bicep to his shoulder. He tried to flex his fingers. They barely moved. If his arm seized completely, the zero would roll and he would lose control. He forced himself to release the stick for 5 seconds. The zero immediately began to bank right. He grabbed the stick and corrected. He repeated this every 2 minutes for the next hour. 5 seconds of rest, 5 seconds of panic, then back to steady flight. At 16:15 hours, he crossed the coast of New Britain. He could see land through his fractured vision. He was 140 miles from Rabaul, 15 minutes of fuel remaining. He had made it further than anyone had a right to expect. But 15 minutes wasn't enough. He scanned his instruments again. Fuel gauge, red zone, oil pressure, dropping, engine temperature, rising. The Nakajima Sakai engine was overheating. He had been running it at continuous cruise power for 3 hours. The manual said maximum continuous operation was 2 hours. He was 60 minutes past the engine's design limits. At 16:27 hours, the engine started to knock, a metallic tapping sound that grew louder with each revolution. Sakai knew that sound. It was a bearing beginning to fail. When it failed completely, the engine would seize. The propeller would stop. The Zero would become a 6,000-pound glider with a descent rate of 5,200 feet per minute. He was at 8,000 feet. He had 6 minutes before he hit the ground. He pushed the nose down, trading altitude for distance. The airfield at Rabaul was 35 miles ahead. He could see it now, a brown strip carved into the jungle. He would never make it. The math was brutal. 6 minutes of gliding time, 35 miles to cover. He would hit the trees 4 miles short of the runway. At 16:32 hours, the engine quit. The propeller windmilled for 3 seconds, then stopped. The sudden silence was shocking. For 3 hours and 45 minutes, the engine had been screaming at 2,200 RPM. Now there was nothing except the whistle of wind over the wings and the sound of Sakai's own breathing. He was at 4,000 feet. The runway was 3 miles ahead. He could see Japanese fighters parked along the taxiway. He could see ground crew working on aircraft. They couldn't see him. A Zero gliding at 90 knots makes almost no sound. At 2,000 feet, Sakai realized he was going to overshoot the runway. He had too much altitude. He pulled back on the stick and held the Zero at minimum speed, bleeding off height. At 1,000 feet, he committed to the landing. He pushed the nose down and aimed for the near end of the runway. At 500 feet, he reached for the landing gear handle with his right hand. His right hand was still holding his eye in its socket. He tried to lower the gear with his left hand while holding the stick with his knees. The gear handle wouldn't move. It required two hands to operate. He made a choice. He released his eye, grabbed the gear handle with his right hand, and pulled. The eye fell out of the socket again and hung against his cheek. The landing gear came down, green lights, both main wheels locked. He grabbed the stick with his left hand and pushed his eye back into the socket with his right hand. He was at 200 feet. At 100 feet, a gust of wind hit the Zero from the right. The aircraft rolled left. Sakai corrected, but he overcorrected. The right wing dipped. The right wheel touched down first. The Zero bounced. Sakai shoved the stick forward. The Zero slammed onto the runway, both wheels and the tail wheel hitting simultaneously. The impact compressed Sakai's spine and sent a shockwave through his skull. His vision went completely black. He was rolling blind down the runway at 70 miles per hour. He pressed both feet on the rudder pedals to keep the Zero tracking straight. He couldn't see the end of the runway. He couldn't see if there were obstacles ahead. He couldn't see anything except darkness. The Zero rolled for 200 feet and stopped. Sakai sat in the cockpit, blind, holding his eye in place, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. He heard voices shouting in Japanese, running footsteps, hands on the canopy. Ground crew pulled him from the cockpit. They thought he was dead. His flight suit was soaked in blood. His face was a mask of dried blood and tissue. His right eye was hanging from the socket. When they laid him on the ground, he opened his left eye and said, "Don't touch the eye. It's still attached." The flight surgeon arrived 4 minutes later. He took one look at Sakai's skull and said, "Get him to surgery now." They carried him to the medical tent. There was no anesthetic available. The surgeon cleaned the wound with alcohol, pushed the eye back into the socket, and stitched the eyelid shut. He removed 3 bone fragments from Sakai's brain and closed the skull wound with 47 stitches. Sakai was conscious for the entire procedure. The surgeon told him he would never fly again. The optic nerve was severed. The right eye was permanently blind. The skull fracture had damaged his inner ear. His balance would never recover. Even if it did, his depth perception was gone. A pilot with one eye couldn't judge distances. He would kill himself trying to land. Saburo Sakai refused to believe him. 3 months later, he was back in a cockpit. He had taught himself to judge distance using ground reference points. He compensated for his missing depth perception by flying lower approaches and using visual cues other pilots ignored. He flew 200 more combat missions before the war ended. His final tally was 64 confirmed victories. After the war, Sakai returned to Japan. He worked as a printer. He wrote a book about his experiences called Samurai. He became friends with some of the American pilots who had tried to kill him. In 1984, he visited the United States and met the rear gunner who had shot him, Harold Jones, now 62 years old. They shook hands. Jones asked Sakai how he had survived. Sakai said, "I refused to die." Saburo Sakai died on September 22, 2000, at the age of 84. He was buried in Atsugi, Japan. His Zero, the one he flew blind for 560 miles, was never found. It was likely scrapped for parts in 1943, but the flight surgeon's notes survived. They're in the Japanese Naval Archives. At the bottom of the medical report, the surgeon wrote one sentence: "This pilot should have died. I have no explanation for why he did not." Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Saburo Sakai doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.